Welcome back to the Blazor Server in-depth course. In this lesson, we're going to wrap up this section by going over our homework and reviewing what we've learned. So let's start by looking at what our homework was again. Our homework is to create a Blazor site with the following: a class that is shared only inside the same instance that stores the counter value and the log counter value changes. All right, so there's two things there. One is that this is a shared class, but only inside the same instance. And then that it also logs every time the counter value changes. All right, so there's kind of two parts there. And now that you've seen both logging and the different types of dependency injection types, we know pretty much where to look for those two things at least. Next is a weather forecast with the number of days specified in the app settings.json file. We did that earlier, so it's pretty much the same thing we did before. It's just practice doing it again. And then finally, a better looking table for the weather forecast. That's just working with Bootstrap. And we've seen how to do that. So we can do those things, these things. I'm sure of it. So let's go over to Visual Studio and create a new project. Increment the value. We can say underscore log dot log information. The counter was incremented to, and then we'll say the counter value, like so. And then we can say counter value is fine. Whoops. Counter value, like so. And so yes, these do match up, and that's fine if they do. And in fact, usually I do that, but they don't have to, like I showed you before. But that way it kind of corresponds pretty clearly. All right. So now we have this class that we created, counter service, where we're bringing in the iLogger for logging, but we don't have this yet in our dependency injection. Well, let's first create an interface so that we can then unit test this well later. So I may do that a little fast. Control dot up here, and the last option is extract interface. And then if you don't do anything, it's just going to bring both of these and you hit OK. And now the interface looks like this. Notice there is no set because we have it as a private set on our implementation. That's fine. So now we can go over to our startup.cs, and down here in configure services, we can say services.add. We have a few options: singleton, scoped, or transient. We want scoped, which scope is going to give us that balance that we need, where we want it to be shared inside the same instance. So it's like a singleton, but only per person or per instance of this. So add scoped, we're going to say I counter service and counter service, and then now it's added to our dependency injection system. Now that it's added to dependency injection, first of all, we can access it in other places, but also it will get this iLogger filled for it. All right, so we got kind of get both values there. So now we can go over to our pages and go to counter. And right here, we can bring in that inject statement. We can say, I'm not sure that we have, let's go look. Yep, we need the using statement. So we'll bring that using statement over as well. So using Blazor app.data. And now we can inject the I counter service, and we can say, let's just call it counter service, like so. And now we can use this down here in the increment count. Now this increment count will never be called unless this first is filled, because that's part of rendering the page. So we don't have to do that protected override and look for the uninitialize or anything else. All right, so we can use this down here. So what we can do is we can change this code to say counter service dot increment counter, and then current count equals counter service. I keep doing that. Counter service dot counter value. All right, so we're doing a two-step process here. We're first reading from, oops, that's not a method, it's a property. We're first reading from, we're first updating the counter, and then we're reading from it. All right, remember we can read from it just fine. There's a get, but there's no set, because that's what this method does, is it uses the private set to do it privately so that we can make a change to that value and log it. Now, like I said, you could do this all inside of a full property. You don't have to get a private set. I just tend not to put logic inside my property getters and setters if I can help it. So I try not to do that too much, or not like this, okay? So if you want to, it's not going to hurt anything. You can do it. It's just a personal preference is all. In some ways, you could argue that this really does belong in the set, and that's what the sets are there for. Again, it's up to you, all right? Saying either way is just fine. All right, so now that's how we increment the count. Let's make sure this works by running this page. So, wait for it to load. First of all, we should see, let's go back over here and change our output. Our output window should show us a value change as we change the counter. So go to counter page, click the click me. Notice the counter was incremented by 1. We go to home, we come back to counter, it's 0 again. Now I thought we were capturing that new value. Well, if I click me again, it's now 2. So why is it 0? I come back to it. Well, that's because the initial value right there is set to current count equals 0. So we do need the protected override for on initialized And we're going to say that, and let's fix this tabbing issue. There we go. We just say that current count equals counter service dot counter value. That way, after we get this value, it's going to put it into this variable. Let's try this again. Wait for it to launch. Our output window is showing, which is good. So now I can say counter. We can click it a few times. Notice it changes down there. We go off the page and come back, and it's still that counter value. But let's take this URL and go a new tab. The counter is 0. And if I click it, it says counter is 1, counter is 2. Notice the log statement's there. Back over here, counter is 5, counter is 6. So these are independent of each other. So each user has their own counter value, but they remember it between page calls. Okay? So it's one instance, but it's one instance per user. So it is scoped, not just a singleton. Remember, a singleton would mean that both of these pages would have the same counter number, and that wouldn't be good. All right, so that's working. That's our first homework thing to do. Our next one is the weather forecast needs a number of days to be updated. So let's go into our app settings.json. Let's add a section here. We'll call it weather forecast, just like a 4. We'll create an object here and say forecast days. And we'll say that by default, we have a 10-day forecast. All right, so weather forecast, forecast days. And then in our fetch data, let's does. That takes care of the next thing on our homework. And the final thing is, let's make this table prettier. Again, I like table-striped. And in my header, I like to say that it's the T-head dark. So let's try that out. See how it looks. Wait for it to start, fetch data. There we go. I kind of like that. I think it looks better than what we had before. I think it stands out better. I'm going to go with that as a better look for our table. You might disagree. You might want to change the entire thing and invert all the colors. That's cool. You could do some other things as well. Maybe even change these to be buttons instead, or something like that, or dials. I don't know. But I think that looks good enough as it is. So I'm going to call that good for the third point as well. So now we have done all of our homework. Let's pull it back up real quick. So our homework was to create a class that was shared only inside the same instance. We did that. That stores a counter value. Yep. And that logs counter value changes. We did that. A weather forecast with a number of days specified in the app settings.json file. We did that. And then a better looking table for the weather forecast. Again, we did that. So again, probably it looked like at the beginning of this section, this homework was a little bit overwhelming. There's a lot of stuff to do here, and it's some confusing stuff sometimes. But once we've seen how to use the different Blazor components and what's included in Blazor for us, it makes it markedly easier to go in and do these things. Because a lot of this stuff is just using the tools that have been provided to us. Now you can upgrade those tools if you want to, but right out of the box, those tools are pretty good. And they provide us with a lot of value at our fingertips. So that's it for this section. The next section is probably one you've been waiting for, which is where we dive into pages, how pages work, how to work with the pages, how to change pages and make different layouts and all that cool stuff. Okay, so once you're done practicing this and working with the included tools, then come on back for the next section where you work with pages.